Welcome, everybody, to Mormonism Live. I'm joined by Radio Free Mormon. Tonight, we're going to talk about the church's theology and teachings around the label of Lamanite. And tonight, we have a guest, Ember, who's going to come on. She'll share some background, which will be pertinent to the conversation. And we'll dive into talking at length about various aspects of Mormonism and its theology and teachings that cause, I don't think there's any other way to put it, but harm to those from the Native American communities, from the tribes. So I will bring on here, we'll just, RFM, by the way, first off, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. You know, I didn't have a whole lot to do with this. So when I joined the church, though, I'm old enough to have certainly heard about in real time Spencer Kimball's the president. This was his big deal. One of his big deals, which was the Indian placement program, and I heard about that and about the Indians who joined the church, get their skin gradually becoming whiter to show that the curse was being lifted by divine means. Yeah, and I believed it when they said that to me. So that's all I know about it, and I think it's going to be a good chance for us to hear the other side of that story.
Yeah, and so without further ado, let me bring Ember on. Ember, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you both?
Excellent.
Great, thanks.
Great.
So I'm going to put the slideshow up, but before we jump into it, I'll let folks see the thumbnail there. The title of tonight's episode, Lamanites, Identity and Trauma, Native American Reckoning with Mormonism. Anything you want to say in terms of biographical information, things we should know about you, anything else you want to say too to sort of set the tone for tonight's conversation?
Sure. Yeah, so my name's Ember. I'm a Native woman from the Pacific Northwest, born and raised in the church, born and raised in my culture. Two worlds that kind of didn't always align. Growing up, I was always told that the Book of Mormon was a history of my people and a history of my ancestors, maybe not directly my ancestors, but well enough. And so as I got older, I started studying. And a few months ago, I started reading Second Class Saints, and it really hit me that whether it's within the church, critics of the church, whatever the case may be, that the focus with racism is always on Blacks in the priesthood, and it absolutely should be talked about. So please, when I say things, don't get me wrong that I feel like that shouldn't be talked about. But there is something that gets dismissed often, and that's, erasing the history of Native people. I don't want to debate doctrine. I'm not debating the archaeology thing. I'm not throwing the Book of Mormon out saying, there's lack of evidence, but erasing my identity, erasing our history, rewrites of what people believe in the past, it's harmful. And when your culture is constantly erased, whether it's within religion, school textbooks, or even history, I feel like those of us that have a voice need to be able to start using it. So thank you so much for having me on to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Amber, with your permission, since I asked you before the show started, can you describe to our audience what the designs are on your chin and what they represent?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So I have a tattoo on my face. It's called a 111 marking, chin marking. The Maori people call it a moko, same thing. The 111 is done with a lot of the Athabascan tribes from Alaska all the way down to Northern California. And it was something that was taken away when people were sent to boarding schools and, not being able to represent your culture. But oral history has told us that people that are of royal descent, so whether it's a chief of the tribe or somebody higher up in status, the grandmother or the auntie would give the 111 tattoo to the girl that is coming of age. And so in about 1995, my grandma was visiting New Zealand, ended up getting her 111 at, I think she was in her late 70s. Came home and said, "It's your turn, granddaughter. You need to do it." And I didn't do it for a long time for various reasons, one of them being tattoos and the taboo. But I finally was like, I need to do this. And I asked my kids, "Are you going to be embarrassed?" having a mom with a tattoo, and they laughed and said, "It'd be so awesome." And I asked my husband, "What do you think?" And he was like, "Yeah, do it now. That's great." So, but that's kind of the quick rundown of my 111.
Thank you.
I will note just for folks who see that and think in their head, like, I remember something in Mormonism sort of connecting with that. I'll just put this up on the screen and just remind folks Olive Oatman was a Latter-day Saint who was kidnapped by one Native American tribe and then purchased as an effort to relieve her from the horrible treatment she got. And again, I don't have the two tribes handy. I should have had that, but before the show, I was adding some of these pictures as we were talking. The second tribe ended up purchasing Olive Oatman to get her away from the tribe that was mistreating her. Somewhere in that process, she was given one of these tattoos. I have a secondary picture of her as well, just to note there. So I'll take those off the screen. So if you do see that as being sort of familiar, that might be the story that you were remembering. With that, I'll put back up our slideshow. And if you want to take us through there's several facets tonight. And by the way, this is what I really appreciate, Ember, is that you broke this issue down into multiple categories, multiple talking points within each category, and it becomes crystal clear that this isn't just a one-off issue where there's this one facet of harm being done. This is multifaceted, and I think tonight's conversation will help the audience, I hope believer and doubter or disbeliever alike, to better understand how we talk about Native Americans with an identity tied to Lamanite and Mormonism, and what kind of harm is done. And so the first category here was doctrine in Indigenous identity. So what do you want to say about that?
Yeah. So, kind of as I was saying in my opener, there's always been racism discussions focusing more on Blacks in the priesthood and less on Native Americans. And I think that it's history that's really important to talk about. Again, I'm not trying to dismiss that in any way. But less attention is really given on how the church teachings shaped people, the Native people, how they were viewed, what their identity was. And that Native identity is really central to the church. It's the foundation. The Book of Mormon was written for the Lamanites, for people of this land. And yes, they've changed some verbiage, but for over 100 years, it was written for Native people, for myself, telling me what my identity was. And then, so sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. So this meant that Native American history was explained through a religious narrative that was really created by settlers and created by people who would attend those Christian colleges like Moore's Academy, where they would go and learn how to teach Native Americans to be Christian, which Mormonism also did. But really, giving natives that religious narrative, and what can be confusing at times, and it was for me growing up, is that Lamanites were described as fallen people who were cursed and who would one day be restored. So at one moment, I'm a fallen person and I'm cursed. The next time I'm praised because I've been written about in the Book of Mormon. It's very confusing to a little kid.
The Mormon angle is really interesting, isn't it? Because as I think about it, everybody else who thinks that the Native Americans descended from Jews, right? That group of people, including the Mormons, they think you were Hebrew, but they never thought you were Christian in antiquity. But Mormonism, with the Book of Mormon, says, yeah, you're Hebrew in origin, but you are Christianized Hebrews. And therefore, what we're doing is we are just giving you back what you lost a long time ago so you can thank me.
Yes. Yes. Here you are on a platter, on a gold plate, if you will. Here's your history. Yeah. Yeah. So there were radical ideas that also influenced how Native members were treated. Sorry, racial. I don't know why I said radical. Maybe they were a little radical, but there were times that the dark-skinned Native individuals, I know of a couple of people who were denied the priesthood before So in the late 60s, they were denied the priesthood because the leaders believed that they were Black and lying. Um, and so I think to me that just points to the racial effect that the church has. Um,
So these are two men who were of age. They're members of the church. They're Native Americans.
yep. Yes. They were considered full blood Native Americans, and both of them were denied the priesthood because they were too dark.
It is an interesting thing, right? We'll get into this later, but the church has come to a point where it's acknowledged that Israelites in the New World would have been a minority. And they agree with the science that says that the majority would have been these folks with Asia genetics, came over perhaps via the land bridge. But then you have Mormonism picking out every tan skinned person, Polynesians, people in Mexico, Mexicans, all Hispanic people, all Native Americans, and putting that label on them that they're Lamanites. Meanwhile, it's the Asian genetics that signify the color, the skin color, and the facial look, and the that sort of appearance. And so you get Mormons who go, no, all of those people are Lamanites, and the only reason they're labeling all of those people is because they see a common Asian genetic trait to them. And to me, that's such a strange thing, because once you say, okay, you're right, it's mostly Asian DNA, then any ability to signify who is Israelite is out the window. And the church sort of self-admits that. It no longer knows who exactly are the Lamanites and who isn't. Anyway, I just think it's such a strange thing that what people see, what Mormons see that they're calling Lamanite, is actually certain traits that come from that Asia genetic line. And whether it be tan skin or certain kinds of appearance traits. And yet that's got nothing to do with Israelite DNA, even if it was present.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I kind of have a question on here, like, is the church honoring Native people or redefining them through doctrine? And, some Native people are going to argue that the church's early narratives about Native origin may have been shaped in parts by ideas present in that region. Again, one of those pieces would be like Hiram attending Morse College and going to the school there. And hearing stories about Native people and how to approach them, how to teach them, the Christian gospel, whatever that may be. So I think that it just raises a really important question of, are they trying to redefine it? Are they trying to erase it? What is it that they're trying to do? Because a lot of times it's not presenting as loving, caring, and kind.
And to put a finer point on it from the Mormon point of view, it's not that the Native Americans used to be Christian, it's that they used to be Mormons.
Yeah. That is what I was taught, correct.
Anything else you want to say on this slide here?
Nope, we can jump to the next.
So our next one is going to be faith and cultural erasure. What do you want to say about that facet?
Yeah, so church teachings about Native people didn't only define their history, but it shaped expectations of how they should live or who they should become. Native Americans being identified as Lamanites, leaders often thought that their future really depended on accepting the gospel and becoming part of a mainstream church society. That spiritual progression was sometimes described in ways that suggested moving closer to white America, Mormon culture. Some leaders also spoke out against interracial marriage, teaching that people should marry within their own race. For example, Spencer W. Kimball taught that marriage should generally stay within the same racial background, saying that would prevent problems for families and future generations. And if you don't mind, I want to share a little personal story about that. So my mom met my adopted dad when I was 3, and they dated off and on and got married in the temple when I was 5. And I was leaving primary one day and went down the hallway, and I remember this like it was yesterday. The little 5.5-year-old me going to walk into the bathroom, and 2 sisters were talking outside the bishop's office, and I heard one of them say, "Yeah, I don't know why they got married. They probably shouldn't have." But I guess the stake president is a family friend, and so, and he grew up on a reservation. He's white, but he grew up on a reservation. She grew up, she was an urban native. She didn't grow up with her culture. So, they really had the right to get married because they don't really understand as well. And this is just my little kid brain, but they had a full on conversation. I remember just standing there frozen thinking my parents would truly no longer stay married. I didn't know the term divorce, but I was like, they truly wouldn't stay married if the church told them not to. And I remember years later asking my mom about this interracial thing, and she explained to me what Spencer W. Kimball said. And maybe I wouldn't understand if I were to go and marry somebody within, in Korea or somewhere. I wouldn't understand their background and things. So that's why it's best if you just stay within your race. Really hurtful teachings. It really made it so I was like, where do I belong? They're sealed together and I'm sealed to no one. Where does that little kid get to fit in life? So it was definitely a rough time for me for a little bit because I kept it all internal.
Yeah, these moments when you're young and people have an idea of how the world works based on what their religion taught them, but such is a blind spot that causes them then to make judgments and create labels and pass on harm to a kid who can't quite make sense of the world yet.
Yeah. And RFM had somebody on a while back where the gentleman, a Black gentleman, was like, I've never gotten married because of that. And I just sat and cried listening to him because of this exact doctrine. And it was doctrine. So,
Ember, that's Charles. And I will tell you that
yes.
after meeting him and hearing his story, I cannot hear just the subject of the church teaching, discouraging interracial marriage without immediately thinking of him every time.
Yeah. My heart goes out to him.
I don't know if you have more to say on this slide. I know you've got the little part here that says chosen people, but not fully accepted. And you guys have kind of hit on this, but in the church, at least when I was in it, maybe something's changed. It doesn't seem like anything in this area has, but you have this idea that Native Americans are a chosen people. As you pointed out in the beginning, the Book of Mormon is written to the Lamanites primarily, even though we don't emphasize that anymore. That is what is in the book, and that's who it was designated to. But until a Native American joins the church and takes advantage of the gospel, and even then, but certainly before they take advantage of it, there's a sort of perspective that sees them as even less than or more fallen than the Caucasian next door neighbor who's never joined the church, right? Because without being baptized and enjoying the gospel to its fullest extent, one is still truly a Lamanite, hence the fallen people of the Book of Mormon, and unredeemed. And the book is written in order to bring them back to the Lord. And so I can remember in my ward where I joined the church, where I served as a bishop, we had lots of Hispanic members who saw themselves as Lamanites. And there was this perspective in the ward that we were always sort of working to rescue them, even for the ones who had gotten active again. It's such a strange dynamic. And I only mention that to sort of, I guess, get your thoughts on when you say chosen people but not fully accepted. Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about?
Yes, and also just the fact of the cultural erasure. One of the things I was taught in seminary, my first year in seminary, was the Book of Mormon, and I was taught by a very close family friend of ours, and I love this man to death. But he wrote on the chalkboard how the Nephites, when they were righteous, they were up here, and when they were wicked, they were down here. But the natives, they they weren't ever really righteous or really bad. And I thought to myself, where does that leave me then? Will I ever make it to the celestial kingdom if I'm never, ever, ever going to be good enough? Because I am a Lamanite. Am I ever going to be good enough? And not just, it's not even the other pieces within the church of, am I good enough? Of like, are you worthy to take the sacrament, or are you worthy to attend the temple? It's not even just that. I have a whole nother added layer to that I'm cursed, but yet we're going to talk about how great the people are. I have had to fight with my identity for my whole life, wondering where I fit. Am I chosen? Am I cursed? What is that?
Yeah, Mormonism makes you both, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else you want to say on this one here?
No, I think we're good. We can go to the next one.
Excellent. So the next category here is colonialism and assimilation. And this here, you've got chosen people and controlling native identity. I love the images, by the way, that you created. And so here you've got John Doe, Jane Doe. One's a temple recommend. One is a tribal identification card. What do you want to say about these?
Yeah. So as I was saying, Native people are sometimes called the chosen people, but this idea came with a belief that they needed to change, they needed to convert, and they needed to be brought back to righteousness. It created a message that sounded respectful on the surface, but it truly placed Native identity inside a story, again, written by settlers. It wasn't a story written by Native tribes themselves. Instead of being recognized as independent nations with their own history, we were often seen mainly through the role the church believed they played in a prophecy. Ideas about identity also became kind of complicated when it came to race and belonging to the church. And then at different times, leaders questioned whether somebody was truly Native, like I was saying, partly Native or actually Black. And these assumptions obviously could affect whether somebody was allowed to hold the priesthood or not. The other thing is that, growing up, you have to have a temple recommend to go to the temple. Well, to prove my identity, I have to have a tribal ID that I belong somewhere. I am the only nationality that has to prove my history. I'm the only nationality that has to prove my blood quantum and my lineage. And so nobody else, if you go and ask somebody, oh, you're from China, oh, you're Black, nobody who says, oh, are you half Black? But I can't tell you how many times I would have people say, oh, you're a half breed, or oh, you're only half Native. And so that whole worthiness thing of, am I worthy enough to be Native? Am I worthy enough within the church to go to the temple or do baptisms? That pattern is controlling, not only just from the US side of saying, okay, here's your blood quantum, here's where you are, but the church as well. Controlling my identity. It really sucks at times. It really sucks. So like I was saying, the other thing is when the church or government decides who someone is, they can also take that right away from them. And as Native people, we've seen our rights taken away a lot. And so when you're telling a story, you're defining them and changing their story completely. So in a lot of ways, the church, in telling our story, ends up controlling our identity. And so, whenever somebody says, "Oh, you're a chosen people," it really doesn't feel empowering, because sometimes being told your culture and needing to change, it doesn't feel good. Again, you're not good enough. Are you worthy enough? And then it kind of just shows how assimilation can happen. And maybe not even by force, but just through teachings that kind of reshape how people see themselves, where they belong, how they feel. So it's that controlling piece can be really challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, uh, tying into sort of the race and the priesthood and people of color when it comes to people having black skin, it's such a strange thing to see LDS leaders trying to figure out who among the general population of the church is black, is Lamanite, is again, whatever skin color isn't white, and trying to sort out whether that person is worthy of the temple or worthy of priesthood ordinances. And it struck me one day a few years ago that if we took the presidents of the church from Spencer Kimball all the way back to Joseph Smith and we could do the 23andMe, what we'd end up with is learning that at least some of them, if not most of them, have African DNA in them. Most of us do. And hence this idea of they're trying to sort people out based on skin color, and skin color is only part of the story. Meanwhile, in their own blood, in their own DNA, many of them would have been unworthy of the very ordinances that they were discerning that members of the church population were unworthy of. It's such a strange thing to be sorting people out based on skin color, based on a theology, as you point out, written by settlers on the frontier in the 1800s.
Yeah,
Anything else you want to say here?
I am good.
Okay, so from here we go to the Indian Placement Program, RFM. You mentioned that at the beginning being something that you were aware of when you joined. Ember, tell us what you want to say about this program, which ran a lot longer than I had thought, by the way.
Yeah, hopefully I don't get teary because it's really upsetting to me. So this is a true program that happened, and it was very much promoted by Spencer W. Kimball. Um, and in the October 1960 General Conference, and this was later printed, so you can go and look. It was the church magazine at that time was called the Improvement Era. Kimball described Native children, and I'm going to quote this. Kimball described Native children in the program by saying, "The children in the home placement program in Utah are often lighter than their brothers and sisters in the Hogans on the reservation. It is evident she was several shades lighter than her parents. These young members of the church are changing to whiteness and to delightsomeness." When I have read those in the past, they break me every time, because I could give you story after story of being told, "Wow, you're lightening up. You must be doing something right in life." I hadn't changed anything. I had a bishop tell me that it was my responsibility as a 14-year-old girl to be the example as a Lamanite. Um, Now, mind you, as I got older, I got lighter. Well, we had a pool when I was growing up. I was in that pool all the time, and I got dark, 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 dark. And anytime to this day, I go outside, I get dark. Um, but I wasn't going out as much in my late teens, and this bishop would constantly comment on my skin color. And so when people want to state this whole "it wasn't about skin" or "white and delightsome" or people interpret it wrong, it's not true. the prophet, whether we're supposed to ignore the dead ones or not, this was said in a general conference, meaning it was doctrine, that these people were getting these poor children were taken from their home, put into LDS homes like boarding schools, taught the gospel, spoke only English, lost culture. They didn't, but the church saw it as this: let's teach them the gospel. Let's teach them English. You know, they're so poverty stricken on the reservation. Let's teach them how to handle money. Let's teach them how to use the right words when you pray. Let's teach them how to be a good LDS child. That was the Indian placement program. Let's erase the culture. Let's cut the hair. Let's remove the sacred things that they hold so dear in their lives. That is the bottom line of the Indian placement program. It's no different. What the church did, I would very much compare to the boarding schools. And, you know, we have a saying within the Native community of, you know, we don't want to lose any more children. There shouldn't be a reason that graves are being dug up and finding children that were buried at boarding schools. And while the Indian placement program probably didn't go that far, it still definitely took away their culture and taught them who they need to be.
Yeah. You know, this is, I don't know, I think this is maybe a little different than the quote you shared, because he said it on multiple occasions. But Spencer W. Kimball, the Book of Mormon, tells us that he, the Indian, has a dark skin, but he has promised there that through faithfulness that they all again become a white and delightsome people. It's a strange thing that in order to truly achieve acceptance in the faith, the general membership is taught to see Native Americans as if their skin lightens up, which again, as you point out, if we're in the sun, it's going to darken. If we're out of the sun over time, it's going to lighten a little bit. And yet believing Mormons are looking at every one of those little shifts and they're making judgment calls in their head about what that means. I'll just say this too. I went to, my family went to our home teacher one time. This was not too long before I left the church. You pointed out that the Native American, the Indian placement program ran till 1970. I think Tim Rathbone in the chat said there were some parts of it that actually ran to 2000, right around the early 2000s. And I think Wikipedia mentions that there were some cases that went that far. I went to our home teacher with my ex and my kid, you know, my whole family's together, and he proceeds to teach us that there won't be anybody of color in heaven. People, black people, Native American, all those things. And I just thought to myself, like, that is an insane teaching for you in 2018, whatever it was that he did that, 2017, to have that belief. Actually been earlier than that, 2014, I think it was, because I was still in Ohio and just getting ready to leave. And that theology, I thought, that's kind of crazy. So I corrected him. I said, hey, just FYI, if we ever taught that, we definitely don't teach that anymore. And I thought, where did this come from? But then I look at pictures like this with Christ being trumpeted in for the second coming. And if you'll notice, every single angel is white in skin. And so Mormons were fed it through their art. They were fed it through quotes like President Kimball's. They were fed it through teachings and manuals that in order for someone to be righteous, a person of color, their skin will in fact lighten up to the point where they were being told a story, at least through art, that this is just a thing for this mortal life. This is not a thing for all eternity. It's such a strange thing. Anyway, any thoughts you have on that? Otherwise, I'll just put the slideshow back up.
No, I just, again, think about, you know, being a kid, and where do I fit in if I am not gonna make it as high and righteous as the Nephites? If I'm only gonna get to here, then I don't get to be in that version of heaven. And why? Why don't I get to be in that version of heaven? Because I was born in an awesome native family? Well, that's okay, you know? But at the time, it was very hard for me. I'm not sealed, again, I'm not sealed to anybody, I'm just bumbling along in life. I'm native, so I'm not gonna make it to that to the celestial kingdom. I'm not gonna make it to where that picture depicts.
I think, Bill, that this idea that everybody's white in heaven has its roots all the way back in the Book of Mormon, which is very clear that white skin is a sign of righteousness and dark skin is a sign of a curse. So obviously, it's only going to be the righteous in heaven. Therefore, they're all white skinned.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of groups that believe that.
Yeah. Do you remember how old you were, Ember? I'm just trying to gauge at what point in life you're picking up on things like Spencer W. Kimball's quotes and quotes from the Book of Mormon that RFM's pointing out, where you would have consciously or subconsciously begin to recognize that people are looking at you, trying to figure out if your skin is staying the same color or if it's lightening up as you participate in the gospel.
I was 3.
Yeah. So your whole
Sitting
life.
in primary, singing Book of Mormon stories, where we had to act out and stand up, and they made us do the 2 feathers.
Oh, the line is all about the Lamanites in ancient history.
And we had to stand and do that. And
Given this land, if
everybody
they live righteously. I never thought what that would sound like to a Native American before.
Yeah, I was 3 when I really remember having to stand up, sing that song, do these little motions, and, feathers up, and people would look at me and be like, "Oh, you're like a real Lamanite," and that happened all through primary for me. Um, and a part of it is because I stuck out. I was in a very white ward, and I was always very, very tall and, towered over everybody. I wasn't blonde-haired, blue-eyed. I didn't look like everybody.
Ember, how did that make you feel?
I'm still going to therapy. I think that, it's just, again, I have to reprogram my brain sometimes. I'm very proud to be Native. I love my culture, and, there's so much that I see similarities within the Native, culture and the church, but there are also things that being told my history hurts, it stings, because
Yeah.
it's not true.
Yeah. You point out here, I don't know if I can find it fast enough. Let me see if I can put it up on this other one. You put out here church manuals and pamphlets guided white LDS host families. I'm assuming what you're meaning there is that there were certain materials in the church that existed at the time that were sort of the foundation of how people in the church who took Native Americans into their home under this program would have had as a framing for how they were to perceive, define that person who's in their home.
Yes.
And I know I've got, let me see if I can put it up here just to give a couple of examples of these.
Yeah, so while you're doing that, I'll kinda talk about it. So you know how the, church used to put out, family home evening manuals, so that you could do lessons with your family? Um, they had these kinds of brochures, and manuals, and, um, a historian, I don't think he's super well known, maybe he is, I'm not sure, Matthew Garrett, wrote a book called Making Lamanites, and he talks about several of these pamphlets and, goes into detail on several of the things that were taught to members on how to deal with Lamanite children, how to teach, and I truly do mean deal, but also how to teach them, how to teach them to be Mormon.
Hey, Bill, I'm glad you found this pamphlet. This looks familiar. Is this back from the 70s or 80s?
Yeah, this would have been 60s or 70s, probably still used through the 80s.
It's
I
called
remember.
Lamanites.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was
No,
going
it's
to let the people know who are listening on audio. It's called Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. And I have to note that the very first heading in this pamphlet says, "The Book of Mormon, a history of your ancestors."
Yeah. And I was telling Ember before the show started, see if I can find it here. That right here. There was an Ensign magazine done in a certain month. See if I can see the date, July 1971, where the entire Ensign magazine, the first 30 pages, again, maybe the last 10 pages have some other church business going on, but the first 30, 35 pages are entirely articles about the label of Lamanite and about the various tribes in various places of the country and what the members could do to better support those who fall under the label that the church gave them of Lamanite. And I was sort of surprised to see that, but again, shouldn't be. The Book of Mormon's written to that group of people, rightly or wrongly, and it's strange because I don't think the church is going to go back to doing something like this again. I would be really surprised if they did that. But they also don't want to get away from it completely either.
Yeah. Well, if they go that direction again, I know several people that will be up in arms about it.
Yeah. Ember, I think we all recognize this was not Spencer Kimball's finest hour. And yet, really what he's guilty of is taking the Book of Mormon seriously.
Yeah.
I could see that point. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else you want to say about this one?
No, I'm done going down the sad route.
Okay, so our next category here is church authority and historical accountability. I'm really interested to see what you have to say here.
Okay. So, in the LDS church, leaders are believed to have authority from God through priesthood and revelation. Um, so that means teachings and like Native people identity and assimilation were often presented not just as options, but it was divine truth. When leaders taught that natives were Lamanites, that they needed to be restored or culture should change, members were encouraged to accept the teachings and faith. Um, and the church structure, as we all know, places really strong emphasis on obedience to leadership. The prophet isn't going to lead us astray. And so for many members, questioning teachings from prophets or apostles can kind of feel like questioning God. And I understand that. I feel like many times when we don't want to ask those questions because if the prophet said it, if an apostle said it, then we're questioning God. So this really makes it difficult for Native people or anyone to challenge the idea that affects their identity, culture, or family. And I think even when teachings cause harm, many people believe that they should still trust the leaders. And there are so many examples of this. Also, because of like this authority revelation and obedience, responsibility for assimilation policies kind of become complicated. Some members see them as mistakes. I've seen several people in the chat, I'm embarrassed to be Mormon, or, when are they going to right their wrong? I agree with all of those things. But others, struggle with the idea that those teachings were once presented as inspired. And that kind of falls into that policy versus doctrine thing. And then I think it raises an important question how authority works in the church. what happens when past teachings no longer match current understandings? As Bill points out often, um, prophets, seers, and revelators, why can't they see around corners that these things are just not okay?
One of the few things that I agree wholeheartedly with President Oaks on is that in a church that claims to be led by divine revelation, there's no difference between doctrine and policy.
No.
Yeah.
And I believe some of the things that probably Hiram, who then talked with Joseph about revelation and authority, a lot of Native people are very spiritual people. We believe that we are told things before they happen. Many of us are those spiritual leaders. And I think that in some of those teachings, I would assume, in how to deal with people that don't want to accept the gospel, um, I'm fairly certain that some of those things came up and that possibly the idea of revelation, um, I think that a little bit from the native culture played a part in that as well.
Yeah. I was going to take this off just to put that book up you mentioned earlier, Making Lamanites, Mormon Native Americans in the
Yes.
Indian Student Placement Program. And there it says too, 1947 to 2000, Matthew Garrett. You got me thinking. I've often tried to point out that the church has a lot of trouble acknowledging that Joseph Smith carried out predatory behavior on kids. But I understand why. It's non-negotiable. To say that the founder did that is essentially telling your entire membership that he wasn't worth the adoration or the following or believing in his testimony, right? If we had a founder who truly was a predator on children, which again, the data shows Joseph Smith is practicing several grooming techniques on kids, but it's non-negotiable from the church's standpoint because it hits right at the heart of their truth claims. And I think this issue's the same way. To get away from sabotaging a culture's identity by imposing your own on them when the evidence that such is true is so problematic, but it's non-negotiable because the system would fall apart if it challenged those founding truths that it taught. And so I see why the church has so much trouble getting away from this issue and 100 others. And yet, if this church is ever going to be truly healthy, it's going to have to confront the things that don't add up. Otherwise, it will be playing behind in the score for the rest of its existence, with people looking down on it as strange and people believing weird things and not confronting the truth of where their history goes.
Yeah.
Anyway, any other thoughts here on this one?
I just wish they would say the Book of Mormon has a bunch of nice stories and parables that, teach us how to do nice things and be right and move along instead of continuously saying it's history. It'll never happen, but that's my hope.
Well, certainly in the time I've been a member, the church has gone from viewing the Book of Mormon literally on the issue. And now there's all these people making attempts by hook or by crook to have the Book of Mormon say something different than the skin colors actually changing, right? It
Yes.
occurs to me that their argument isn't with me, and it's not with Bill, and it's not with you, Ember. Their argument is with Spencer Kimball.
Yeah.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah. And I'll just say one more thing, which is whether it's this issue, the point you're making, RFM, or whether it's the polygamy one I just made, or whether it's the 100 or maybe even 1,000 others, it really is the church's effort or its apologists, it's their effort to confront that the truth claim has a problem and then create some space where people can still believe in spite of the evidence adding up more reasonably in a different direction. Okay, there's that. So I'll grab this next one here. Let me go to that. So historical accountability in changing narratives. And to me, this is big, Ember, because the church is often making shifts. Those shifts are often in a healthier direction, but it ends up not being a healthy shift because they never notify the folks who lived through it what changed, why it changed, and lay out for them why we went from point A to point B, and to acknowledge that there must have been something wrong with point A. The church just suddenly shows up, often to only a certain section of its membership, for instance, younger members. It'll show up giving them the shift and allowing the older folks to still continue believing things the old way. It'll show up in the younger folks' manuals first, and then later on for everyone else. And these shifts happen without context. And I think when you change your mind, even just in person to person relationships, when you change your mind and you don't inform the other parties of that change that happened and why, you actually leave people on unstable ground and more distorted than if you just would have left the teaching alone, perhaps. So your thoughts here?
Yeah, so many. I um I don't even know where to begin. I just I wish that it could be different. I just really wish it could be different. The church, says all the time you need to go through the repentance process. Well, the church tells us a lot of things that we need to do and does different. So, can they just one time follow the repentance process and say, I am so sorry that we said this. Um, and we are not going to promote that anymore so that people can move forward and fit and see their actions. And is it genuine that they're not going to do that again? If we're taught that that's what's supposed to do, but they don't do it, why do I need to follow, that? And that's my thinking. Why do I need to follow that example at that point? It's do as I say, not as I do. It doesn't work for me. Just doesn't work for me. Um,
I've heard you have an issue with people who say one thing and do another, Ember.
I have a huge issue with hypocrites. A huge issue. Yeah, I don't like it.
And you get Uchtdorf, who gave a talk a few years back. Oh, well, if you're going to be upset with hypocrites, aren't we all hypocrites? Was essentially the gist of what he's saying. But there's a very big difference between a person being hypocritical and a system that operates on the mode of being hypocritical. To me, those are two very different things. And if Uchtdorf wants to grant a church leader here or there who has stumbled and talked out both sides of their mouth, so be it. But when the system continually shields its past and the leaders who said things in that past from having to be accountable to what they got wrong, I think that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other thoughts here?
A few actually. So I know that the church has kind of stepped away from some of its past teachings about race and the native identity assimilation. But again, it doesn't change the hurt. It doesn't change the trauma. It doesn't change people's experience. And I know that they're kind of stepping away from saying that skin color is a curse. They don't really mean skin. And they've ended the Indian placement program. So, like Bill says, there are steps that they take. They're little ones, but they're taking them. And then there's certain things like the teachings that they've spoken about in general conference or printed magazines, like Bill, you were showing. Um, they're kind of taking those pieces away, but it's quietly. And so, some people I ask by doing that, is the church fully taking accountability and responsibility for those things that they're doing? Absolutely not. And so, you know, official histories often focus on faith and sacrifice and good intentions, but Native experiences sometimes include loss of culture, pressure to assimilation, again, and that feeling of identity just kind of being redefined.
Mm.
Um,
You know,
yeah.
Ember, I imagine that there's lots of people out there watching the show who are younger than I or joined the church more recently than I did. And this is a surprise to them, these things that Spencer Kimball said in General Conference, this whole attitude, this whole program. But I lived through it. So this is just like, taking me back to when I joined the church. It's all exactly the way it happened. And I think one of my concerns is that after a while, that generation will pass who knew about these things. And then, if the church has its way and these things are not memorialized and repeated, they will be forgotten.
And that's why I want to be here today to talk about these things, to stand up for those that are either scared to say something. But, there's definitely the receipts are here that show that these things were a thing. So, and I understand that like historical accountability can be difficult for a religion, but it's going to be a lot more difficult when people believe that the leaders are guided by God. And you know, again, are they really seeing around corners?
Well, God was
So,
for the Indian placement program before he was against it.
sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that these conversations are not always about like blaming the past. Maybe a little bit, but sometimes it's more about just honestly understanding it so that people today can decide what they want to believe, but with the full knowledge of history. That informed consent piece is so real. People need to have all of the pieces to make the decisions that they want. And I think that telling these stories and, coming here today, even, it's slowly reclaiming that voice and identity and the truth that wasn't always included in our narrative within the church.
I agree with you that the church making changes over time in the right direction is a good thing and should be applauded, but that alone is not accountability.
Correct.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think it's way better to be ignorant than dishonest. And when I look at the leaders in the past, I see a lot of ignorance. But when I watch the leaders today distance those past statements from conversation, distance those past statements from uh, being out in the open and talked about and context given and understanding for why shifts were made, I start to think and have for a long time that the leaders today are much more deceptive, whereas at least some of the leaders in the past might have been more ignorant. And I'll pull up here just to give an example to the audience of one of these. I mean, here's the 1981 introduction to the Book of Mormon. All were destroyed except the Lamanites, and they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Well, the
Because there
church,
might have been a little Oriental blood coming through, right, Ember?
oh yeah,
That's a
absolutely.
that's a Spencer Kimball quote too.
yeah,
Mhm.
I've got that in here, but uh, Kimball acknowledges that maybe there were a few from Asia, but most of the folks we call Lamanites are, in fact, those are the Native Americans that are of the descendants of Lehi, Nephi, and all of that family. Here's where they make the change. This is the 1981 versus the current. Rather than being the principal ancestors of the American Indians, they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. And so then you get the church in its gospel topic essay finally acknowledging that scientists, again, if you read the underlying sections, the evidence assembled to date suggests that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. They also don't tell you the next sentence, which is needed, which is the evidence also says that none of Native American DNA has Middle Eastern component to it that dates to the right time period. That's not part of it. But then this last part, they say these people, scientists say, spread rapidly to fill North and South America and were likely the primary ancestors of modern American Indians. And they're talking about, by the way, they're talking about the folks with Asia genetics that came across the land bridge. And so they're finally acknowledging the science here. They're carefully wording it. They're keeping the members from understanding what the rest of that DNA is outside of Asian DNA. But then you get the apologists who come along and say, no big deal. We shouldn't have expected to find Israelite DNA anyway. It just got diluted because there were so many Asians here as Native Americans, Asian DNA folks, that when the Middle Eastern folks came, the genetic drift happened and it just disappeared. And so even when you get the church telling the truth, it isn't telling the truth, and it still wants to shield its truth claims from any degree of like honest tackling of how the world works.
If you can go back to that last slide, that first sentence you have on there, I think has 4 qualifiers in the one sentence. This is a tough sentence for the church to have to write, but they're trying to make it as good for them as they possibly can. So let's see. The evidence assembled to date suggests that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. 4 qualifiers, one sentence. My kudos to you.
Yeah, they did great there, didn't they? That's what a carefully worded denial looks like.
Good to know.
Yeah. All right, I'll put this back up. Anything else on this one?
No, I think I've touched on everything. Thank you.
Yeah, and always take your time. I want to make sure that even at the risk of me contributing to you stumbling a touch when we pick back up on these, I'd much rather you take a moment and make sure you're sharing everything that you would like to share. The next section here is land colonialism in Utah Territory. What do you have to say about this one?
So, so Mormon settlement in the West can be seen as part of that larger pattern of American settler colonialism, where like expansion was justified by religion and progress and belief Native people needed to change. So natives have lived on this land, whether it's in Utah, no matter where you walk right now in the United States and Canada, Mexico, natives lived here for thousands and thousands of years. DNA has proven that, unlike the Book of Mormon. And so the Book of Mormon places native tribes into like this religious story that's controlled by Mormon settlers, where native people were seen as fallen people, needed to be taught the gospel and brought back to righteousness. And then because of this belief, the settlement in native lands were often described as part of like their divine mission. Instead of being seen as taken land and taking people's land, it was more framed like, look at this prophecy being fulfilled. Brigham Young saying, this is the place. And now we can help Lamanites return to God. As Mormon communities grew and they built towns, farms, missions, settlements obviously are going to expand into native tribes area where they depended on these areas for hunting and fishing and travel. We are a traveling people. Even here in the Pacific Northwest, people would travel up and down the Columbia River and put up their settlements. And they recently, probably within the last 15, maybe 20 years, recently found boarding that they believe belonged to a plank house that was along the Columbia River. And they would throw the boards back in the river so people wouldn't know where they settled. And this exact thing happened within the Great Basin. And then obviously the expansion led to like the Black Hawk War and wars happening. Natives being blamed for causing wars like Mountain Meadows Massacre. Sometimes these things happen because Native people were trying to resist losing their resources. They weren't trying to be going out just to go out and fight. They literally were losing their livelihood because of, settling and the growth of the church. And then that's where we get into conflict within settlement as Native tribes were pushed onto reservations. And reservations are often a lot smaller, and they're usually not very good land. And tribes were definitely forced to change their ways. One thing that I'll kind of expand on a little bit here in a moment. Treaties made with the U.S. government often did not respect how Native people traditionally used land. Land that had been shared or used seasonally was divided and controlled by the government. And then over time, the US government would force those signing treaties as a caveat: you need to become Christian. And my where our tribe is, we're a confederated tribe. There's 26 nations within our tribe, bands, if you will. Um, my grandma's grandfather was the one that signed our treaty, and he signed it saying, "Okay, we'll live in this spot. We just don't want to move anymore. You've already made us walk, 200 plus miles to be here. Can we just make this our home?" And they said, "Yes, but you have to become Christian." Um, and so he signed that treaty, but he was forced to sign it. And this happened with a lot of tribes. A lot of tribes were like, if you want this treaty, you have to become Christian and you have to make sure that people within your tribe become Christian. And so, I this happened in Utah with Brigham Young and the settlers being there. And then Mormon missions and settlements were also built around where native villages used to stand. And so that colonialization was not only about land, it also stood about changing their culture, again, that religion and their identity. So,
Yeah.
thoughts?
I wanted to take this down for a second just to put up something you said, which is how long Native Americans had been on the land. And when I was doing some research for a separate conversation elsewhere around DNA in the Book of Mormon, this was one of the things I came across, which is that when those folks of Asiatic origin came over to North and South America, it was 15,000 years ago. And that traveling began 23 to 25,000 years ago. But they end up over here on this side of the world 15,000 years ago. And yet the Book of Mormon does this story of 600 BC to 421 AD. And it is such a brief moment long after this. It's such a strange thing to corrupt a story. And then, as you point out, it's another atrocity, which is white settlers and the U.S. government displace Native Americans and put them, like you say, put them in places where, like, hey, we'll let you have this land, but it certainly wasn't the choice land to be given. And it also, anytime someone is displaced, as you point out, you have to change your lifestyle because you're in a new place now. The animals to hunt are different. The land is different. The ability to grow crops or to fabricate things is going to be a very different process based on the materials that you have access to. So we forced, we being, settling Europeans, we forced Native Americans to essentially change their entire lives and adjust to something when they had been here for so long. And, we say Indigenous people, we say Native American because you were here first. And so it's not just a religious harm and trauma, but it's also a Western European settler issue that's adding trauma on top of it as well.
For sure. Yeah.
And then did I have another one? Oh, this was the quote you were talking about, RFM. They are not Orientals. They are from the Near East. It is not impossible that there could have seeped across the Bering Strait a little Oriental blood, as claimed by some people. But basically, these Lamanites, including the Indian, are the descendants of Lehi, who left Jerusalem 600 years BC. And then, of course, the Jonathan, I forget what his last name is, but Jonathan, who came up with these for Miston Sunday School, says the evidence assembled to date suggests the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. That is the Gospel Topics essay refuting Spencer W. Kimball. So as you point out, it's Spencer W. Kimball that believers should take up their argument with, not the three of us having this conversation.
And if I can give that a little bit of context, what Spencer Kimball is saying, since between the three of us, I'm probably the only one who was alive then back in 67 when he said it. But here's my understanding, okay? We may think that the understanding of the Native Americans being strictly from Asia, no Israelite DNA among them pre-Columbus, okay? That comes from DNA, which is relatively recent. But, and this is my understanding, this has been the understanding of science for a long time before the DNA testing based upon blood type. Because blood type shows the exact same thing. Big surprise, right? DNA confirms the blood typing of the 60s. It was around in the 70s. I remember encountering this between the time I joined the church in 78 and leaving the mission. On the mission in 79, yeah, I encountered this idea that this was in conflict. The blood typing showed that the Native Americans were of Asian descent, not from the Middle East. And I imagine that's what he's responding to here, where he's saying there are, it is not impossible that some of that Oriental blood, right, could have seeped across the Bering Strait, a little Oriental blood, as claimed by some people. I think that's who he's talking about. Except they're claiming, no, it's all Oriental, as he puts it.
Yeah. And I'll say one more thing about the apologetic argument in regards to DNA, which is if Native Americans had 5%, if 5% of them had Israelite DNA that comes into the genetics at the right time, I think there wouldn't be a whole lot of pushback. There'd be pushback against Kimball and his dogmatic views, but there would be room to see Native Americans, at least in part, as having Israelite heritage if you go back far enough. The reason apologists come up with implementing or imposing genetic drift is because the geneticists among the apologists agree that we do not find the right DNA. We don't find Middle Eastern DNA. And in the very little bit we do, it is shown to enter the genetics at the wrong time period. So you only need a solution like genetic drift when you're agreeing with the science that it's not there and it should be. So there's that. Okay, back to this. Anything else here?
We are good.
Okay. All right. Theocracy, power, and control in the Utah Territory. And you noted this in the last slide. I was appalled when I learned just how many conflicts there were between various tribes of the Native Americans and Brigham Young and the Mormons. And when you join the church and you're learning about its history, you start with the assumption that, of course, Mormons are going to have a great working relationship with the indigenous people of the Americas. Of course they are. And then what you find out, as you pointed out, is not only does Brigham Young blame Native Americans for the Mountain Meadows Massacre long after he knew for a fact that it was his own people that did it, but that there were all of these, and you can go on Wikipedia, by the way, and look up the Wikipedia article on, let me get to the title of it here, Native American People and Mormonism. And if you go to the section that's violence, you get all of these various battles. Battle Creek Massacre, Provo River Massacre, Skull Valley Massacre, Nephi Massacre, the Squaw Fight, Grass Valley Massacre, you got the Circleville Massacre, Fountain Green Massacre, Salt Creek Canyon Massacre. And all of these instances are moments where the Native Americans and the Mormons bumped into each other. And in most of those situations, when you read the history, it was the Mormons who were being unhealthy and unreasonable and committing acts of violence on these people that our theology taught us, at least to some degree, to respect and honor. And so again, I think there's this moment where Mormonism is talking out of both sides of its mouth, saying that it honors those who are Lamanite. Meanwhile, it treated the Native Americans at multiple points in its history as less than themselves.
Yeah, and as much as I don't want to, I do want to give a smidget of grace in that I don't think that the Native people understood the culture and vice versa, of certain things. And so, that they could have just been like, um, an argument over something that went sideways, or it could be, hey, we gifted you this and you didn't gift us something back. So there was an acknowledgement, so there could have been those types of things too. But um, I've okay, I'm done being nice. Okay, so um, in the Utah Territory, the church was not only a religion, but also it was the main political power, as we know. Um, Church leaders often held government positions and they controlled the settlements, influenced how laws were enforced. Um, and so, because they were in power, they made a lot of decisions about land. Native relations and expansions were often made by church leadership rather than tribes themselves. The leaders kind of said, this is what you are going to do. Um, I understand that they believed they were building Zion, a religious, their religious society, and that it was commanded of God to establish the West. Um, and the belief made it feel like there was this divine duty, even when it meant settling on lands where Native people had lived forever. Um, I think that Native tribes in the Great Basin use land differently than the settlers did, kind of as we were touching on earlier. Many tribes obviously move seasonally for hunting and fishing and gathering, but settlers believe the land should be owned and farmed and permanently occupied. Um, and so, because of the difference, settlers often described native land as empty or unused, so we can use it. Um, Brigham Young even taught what became known as the Indian policy, feed them rather than fight them. Um, and that is a Brigham Young quote. He encouraged settlers to trade with native tribes, give food instead of immediately using violence. But believe he wanted to keep the peace. I don't know that that was always true. Um, the policy obviously wasn't always followed. I think it was oftentimes not followed because as settlers arrived and resources became limited, obviously conflicts are going to arise. Again, including the Walker War, the Black Hawk War, all those different massacres that you listed, Bill. And the native groups really were resisting losing the land and access to food and their civilization. So even if the policy was super peaceful or sounded peaceful, it still placed native people in a position where they ended up having to depend on the settlers in the area. So providing food and aid often came with the expectation of become Mormon, accept the teachings, change your ways, and then um, you also need to allow our settlements to expand and stop taking up certain areas. I also think that during this time, well, I don't think, but during this time, Native people are often treated as dependents or obstacles instead of independent nations. Um, some systems even allowed Native children to be placed in Mormon homes as servants or laborers. I can tell you several tribes, not just within Utah and the Great Basin, Native people were slaves. Um, and they, specifically within this Utah territory, Native children were placed in homes under the belief that it was helping them to become civilized. Um, Also, church leadership and the territorial government obviously was closely connected. And so Um, sorry, I lost my place and my train of thought. They are closely connected. Colonization in Utah was both a religious project, but it was also a political one. The settlement wasn't always about the land. Sometimes it really was about the culture and the religion and the identity to overrun those things. Um, and I think understanding this kind of helps show that the settlement in Utah was part of a larger pattern within America and colonialism in general, even when it's described as a, people will describe it as a mission of peace or saving your salvation. It's was very problematic.
You brought up an interesting point that not only did the indigenous people have to deal with the sense of entitlement that some Western settlers and in some aspects of government held, to the point where, again, we moved you off your land and relocated you. But also the church, within the church, you have these people who think it's their divine right. They have these stories of how Columbus was guided by the Spirit. And so someone such as Christopher Columbus is given almost a saintly designation. You get where the founders of the country or the reformers are contributing to setting up a place, a space whereby the gospel can be restored here and the members of the church can thrive. You have the Book of Mormon talking about how this land had been prepared for the Book of Mormon people, but now that the Lamanites have killed the Nephites, now this land is given to those who come along in the 1800s to take advantage of the restored gospel. And so as Mormons go out west, when it comes between figuring out how we share this land peacefully or find ways to work together, instead, the Mormons have this divine edict that at the end of the day, this land was prepared for us. And to think that that notion doesn't have any effect across the culture, I think would be naive. Any thoughts from you guys?
Agreed. It's just sad. It's
All right.
sad history, but it's history.
Yeah. Okay. With that, we go into this last section. There's several slides here as we start to wrap up, but this section you've named trauma and deconstructing. And so now I think you're going to help us make sense of how we make sense of it. So this one here is living between two worlds. Ember, what is it like to live between two worlds?
I don't know any different. Been doing it my whole life. And I'm not exactly sure how to articulate this or communicate it without kind of talking more about like me personally. So I will say that I am not talking about all natives within Mormonism. This is maybe more a little bit about me, but I think that it's important. People will understand, and I think that it'll resonate with people. So growing up Native and Mormon meant living between two worlds that didn't always fit together. And the tension affected more than just my beliefs. It affected my mental health a lot. It affected my sense of identity, and it affected how I saw myself growing up. On the one side, I have my tribal identity. I go to powwows, our ceremonial gatherings. I go to family gatherings, cultural events. I attend culture camps and teach people how to do, braid grass or how to polish pine nuts or how to do all of those things. And there's that side of me. But then there's another side with the church and its own teachings about what was right and wrong, what was considered spiritual, and really what you did was acceptable. The two worlds couldn't exist a lot within my life. And I will say that I always felt the spirit more, and it's to this day, I don't call it the spirit, but I feel more at peace when I am at Native events and with my family than I ever did at church. There are times that I definitely was sitting in church and felt a lot of conflict, and I didn't understand why I wasn't quote unquote feeling the spirit, but I could go stand outside and just take in a, a deep breath and enjoy the scenery. Um, it was really hard as a child to understand why parts of my culture sometimes felt like it had to be hidden or avoided. Um, an example would be like, growing up, we would go to ceremonies and there would be some traditional native prayers, and my mom would always step away. And so then, of course, I would step away, and I really didn't understand it. Um, but as I got older, I started to understand, oh, this is more like something that happened. It's similar to something that happens in the temple. Um, and, I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it very much, there's certain things that we do that I saw in the temple. And so I think for her, it also conflicted. It also created confusion because I love my culture. I love who I am. Um, I always wanted to do the right thing. Um, but I also wanted to be me. And that kind of conflict creates a lot of just internal stress. And especially for somebody who just wants to belong. And again, I didn't know as a kid where I belonged. There were these two worlds that were in some ways complemented one another, and sometimes it was contrast. At church, I was told one thing: you're a Lamanite, you're part of this story. If you believe it and follow it, you're going to be accepted. Um, but then I knew I'm an Indigenous woman. I have my own tribe, my own history. We have certain traditions that existed long before the church. And so there were times that I felt like I had to show um, different parts of myself. And I code switched a lot. Um, at church, I was the Maya Maid president, I was the Beehive president, I was on the seminary council. Like I did all of those things. Um, and so, I knew how to be those things, what I needed to be to survive at church. Um, and I didn't, like I said several times, I didn't look like other people. I didn't come from the same kind of background. Um, ethnically, racially. And so I always felt like an outsider looking in a lot of times. And these two worlds, it created a lot of pressure to be perfect when I was in the church, not to make mistakes, and always having to prove where I belonged. And so it does cause a lot of identity trauma. Um, and, but I can tell you that, like, looking back now, I can see that struggle wasn't always just about religion or culture. It was trying to really understand who I was within a system that didn't fully understand people like me. It didn't understand me. And that kind of experience can stay with you for a long time, but it doesn't have to stay with you forever.
Thank you.
Ember, as you're talking, it occurs to me that the message that Mormons have for Native Americans really is essentially this: we're here to help you, but first you have to admit that you are cursed.
Yep, 100%. I agree with that.
I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if we're at the end of the slides. Are we, Bill?
We have
I'll wait till the end, because the question I'm going to want to ask you has to do with, you said you were born in the church, raised in the church, and I'm going to want to ask you about where you are on your spiritual journey vis-a-vis the LDS church.
yeah, there's a few slides left, and then let's do that. By the way, anything else here you want to say?
No.
Okay,
That's
so
good.
generational trauma, this to me is a big one. Even just that picture sort of brings out a ton of feelings and thoughts inside. What do you have to say about generational trauma, this facet of your conversation?
Yeah, so generational trauma, I think anybody can carry it, but it's something that many Native families carry, and it doesn't always come from one place. It comes from history. It comes from government actions, from family struggles, but it can come from religion too. And so for many of us, that trauma doesn't always start even with our own experiences. It can start generations ago with our ancestors, who were forced to leave their land, who were forced to travel long distances, who had to learn how to survive in a world that was changing around them. Um, those experiences affect families for generations. Hard lives, poverty, abuse, addiction, loss of culture are a lot of things that Native communities have had to work through. And those struggles, they just don't disappear. They get passed down, sometimes even without us realizing it. And so, for those of us that are raised in the church, there can be another layer of trauma connected to religious teachings. Again, that teaching of the history and the history that is connected to the Book of Mormon. You know, science, archaeology, DNA evidence, it doesn't support the story. So many Native people, including myself, we've taken DNA tests and found no connection to the Middle East, zero. Even though church teachings say that's where our ancestors come from, well, or they used to teach that. So when you grow up being told that your history is something different than what your own people know to be true, it creates a lot of confusion and shame, and sometimes even guilt. It can feel like your identity is being replaced with a story that was totally written by somebody else. Um, you know, there were people that went through the Indian placement program when being encouraged to leave their home, leave their language, leave their tradition to go fit into a church culture. That creates a lot of generational trauma. I understand that these programs were meant to help, but they often caused a lot of identity issues, and it did affect those people's the next generation for those people that experienced that the IPP. So, um, again, Native people can carry cultural trauma, religious trauma at the same time. It's not always about leaving the church. It's about sorting through history, family experiences, and beliefs that were taught as truth, and trying to figure out what is real and what belongs in somebody else's story. Realizing that I think for me, a big thing is the Book of Mormon is somebody else's story. Um, but I was taught something different, and it has caused some issues. And so I think talking about generational trauma, it's not really about blaming the past, but it's like, what can we do to move forward so that healing can actually happen instead of continuing that pain? A lot of times people will say, well, this abuse or this insert bad thing here stops with me. And that's one of the things that a lot of Native people do say. The alcoholism, the drugs, the poverty, it stops with me because of the generational trauma.
Hmm. Any thoughts from you, RFM?
No.
I will say, I mentioned this earlier, but I was in a ward that I had joined. I served as the bishop of that ward that had a large family of a Hispanic family, and the ward talked about them specifically as Lamanites. That was the labels we used. And I remember early on in my time in the church, that family, this was a large family. This was like 10 different households of various members of the family, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandma and grandpa. There was I could be wrong, but I perceived a sense of pride early on that we're Lamanites. And then as time went on, some of them, maybe about a third of that family, ended up deconstructing and stepping away from the church. And again, this is my impression, having had some limited interaction with them, is that now they resent that. They have contempt for that. And again, when you tell a religious narrative and you tell it in a one-sided way that conveys to the person listening that this is the true narrative, meanwhile, you leave out any discussion of all the problems and the contradictions, when somebody learns, especially when you're giving them an identity, when they learn that they're not the label you're giving them and that there are lots of reasons to decide otherwise, it feels like some of the unhealthiest thing you can do to somebody. I'm thinking of other moments in my life where I invested myself in the story the church was telling, and when I learned that the church's story didn't add up on that issue, and it doesn't add up on 1,000 issues, there's a betrayal. And these folks, again, in what limited interaction I've had with them, I sensed a deep amount of betrayal because they had given up aspects of their actual heritage in order to fit into the one that was being given to them that didn't hold up to the way the church framed it. Anyway, I can only imagine. And so as we get into the next slide here, the next one here is faith, shame, and worthiness. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, just kind of want to add to what you were saying. It's kind of like when people investigate the church, we tell them Joseph Smith saw Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. We tell them about, the very, very basic primary answers. It isn't until you get in and start looking that you start understanding you were given a very, very small portion. I've known members that were Black that joined before the ban was lifted, and they were like, had no idea. And
Mm,
now I'm part of this system and I can't go to the temple or I can't partake in all the blessings. It's very hurtful.
mm.
So,
Yep.
yeah. So, on this topic of faith, shame, and worthiness, like those of us that have grown up in the church or have been in the church, the idea of worthiness was something that we were taught very, very, very early. We were taught that being worthy meant that we were obedient, we were following the rules, we were living the way the church expected us to live. And for many people, that already creates pressure to have to do all of those things. But as a Native person, the pressure can feel heavier. Um, we're often talked about as Lamanites. Um, there's always this idea that we came from a fallen people who needed to be restored. Even when it wasn't directly said, it could feel like our culture and our history, even our families, were something that needed to be fixed in order to be fully accepted. And I can tell you, if you feel this way, it is not true. Just want to validate you. It can create a lot of shame without even realizing it. You can start to feel like you have to prove that you're good enough, that you're faithful enough, that you're obedient enough, because you just want to be enough. You just want to belong. And when you already come from a background that's different from the majority of the church, it can feel like, at least to me, it felt like I had to work twice as hard just to fit in. I really got tired at times where my bishop would tell me that I needed to do better and be the example. I don't know why that weight was on my shoulders as a kid. I think that teachings about worthiness obviously is going to affect yourself. If you struggle, you make mistakes, you question things, it can feel like you're the problem instead of the system. And the system is where a lot of this should sit. Um, for Native people, that feeling obviously is going to connect to generational trauma, like we just talked about, where your history is already being told that your people were less than, and that your way of life was wrong. Your ancestors lived wrong, they were incorrect. There can also be shame connected to culture. They don't pray the right way. We have specific ways within the church that we had to open and close our prayers, how we had to bear our testimonies, or how we had to end our talks. Um, You had to fast the right way, make sure that you had your prayer, you had to wear the right clothes. Some traditions, ceremonies, or beliefs from home might feel like they don't fully fit in with what the church teaches, and um, it can make you feel like you have to choose which part of yourself is acceptable. Um, that kind of pressure obviously is going to cause some mental health issues. It's going to lead to anxiety, more than likely, guilt, perfectionism, scrupulosity, the feeling that no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be worthy. And for me, that was I'm never going to be able to get to the highest kingdom with my family because I'm just so. And then for many people who later start to question or leave the church, um, one of the hardest things is to let go of that shame. Again, does that feeling belong to you or the system? Um, I've worked years on learning how to find and reclaim my worth, that it's not based on how closely I fit in that Mormon mold. Um, and also that my identity and culture, my true history, it's not something that needs to be fixed. The system needs to fix how they teach. And so I think understanding that is really kind of an important part of healing because it allows you to separate faith from guilt and self-worth from the expectation that was placed on you by the system as you were growing up.
It seems as though your family being in the church, your family tried to navigate hanging on to both your heritage as well as wrap your arms around Mormonism. But I have to imagine that at least at least some members of your family and other folks who try to do that feel like like the church is looking at them as being an apostasy. You sort of hinted at this at some of the things you said, but as you try to incorporate your native customs and traditions, Mormonism has so much teaching around false teachings and what that means. And anyway, would can you speak to maybe any feelings that you or maybe other members of your family had shame or guilt in trying to incorporate your native customs and traditions into your family life?
Yeah, so my parents, and before my dad passed away, but my mom is all in. My parents were all in from the beginning. My dad's history went all the way back to Brigham Young family history. My mom was a convert um, when she was in her teens. And so it's just her and I at this point. And so, it really was me um, that has tried to hold on to both for so long. There are things definitely, within the culture that my mom has taught me how to sew the right regalia or make moccasins or, the other things that I listed earlier. But there's certain parts that definitely she wants nothing to do with, and she will walk away from if they're happening, whether it's certain ceremonies, certain types of prayers. Um, if she's asked to give a prayer at a family event, nobody else is LDS there, but my mom will pray the LDS way. Um, and within the native culture, there's no right or wrong way to pray. Um, but um, she still very much will stand in the middle of events as if she's up front in sacrament meeting giving a talk or saying a prayer. Me, on the other hand, I have fully embraced my culture. And if I'm going to get up and pray, I'm going to get up and pray and say whatever I want, however I want. Um, and I'm going to be okay with it if I don't end the same way as a Mormon prayer. I'm going to be okay. And so I think for a long time I did battle that um, and what I needed to do, but I don't anymore. But I do watch my mom kind of bounce a little bit back and forth. And I have seen it with other people that I know.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure in the system to do that. Um, Okay. Anything else on this slide? Anything else from URFM on this one?
No, just listening with great interest. Thank you, Ember, for being here, for talking about your experience.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you for having me. I can tell, can I say something a little snarky? This is the first episode that I've listened to that RFM doesn't have something for every slide. You're listening with intent. There's always a comment from you. So anyway,
The next one here
Right.
is the next one here is deconstructing the story. I love this picture too. This is what we were talking about earlier. There's no Middle Eastern DNA there, and yet there's a story that's put on you that there is anyway. And in fact, that's essentially what the church and its apologists say, is that there isn't any Middle Eastern DNA, but there is anyway.
yeah.
What do you think here on this one?
So just like with anyone or anything, deconstruction of faith doesn't happen all at once. It usually starts with little questions that you have, small doubts or moments that something might not feel right. For me, it started, I remember asking random questions when I was little, very little. Um, and, for some part of that process was realizing that the story we've been taught about our identity didn't match. Um, Learning the Native history within school was very different than what I had heard at church. And so I would wonder, or listening to my grandma talk about something, I would wonder. So growing up in the church, our history has to fit this story. But again, as you start to learn about history and science, you start to see where the teachings aren't going to line up. And what researchers, our own tribal traditions say where we came from, it doesn't add up. So that realization when you're deconstructing, whether it's, oh my goodness, the church is actually not true, um, or if you're deconstructing as somebody who was called a Lamanite, um, that realization can be hard because it means you're questioning everything you were ever told. Was anything I was told true? Was my whole life a lie? Um, and so at certain points within deconstructing, it doesn't just come about religion. And for anybody that is of color, um, at times it can come of identity, um, that your family, the way you understood yourself when you were growing up. Um, and I think deconstruction in any way means that you have to look at church history differently. It thinks that, things that you were once taught as faith promoting can now start to look like colonization, assimilation, or even like just let's change the native people instead of try to understand them, try to learn what their history is, try to learn what their culture is. Um, and there can be a lot of fear in this process of deconstructing. What if I'm wrong? Fear of losing faith or disappointing family, fear of not knowing what you believe anymore. Where do I go from here? Um, I think anybody that deconstructs asks all of those questions. Um, and then the grief that comes with deconstructing. Um, you can feel like you've lost something, you've lost your community. Um, Especially if church was a big part of your life. You go 3 hours on Sunday. In high school, I was going Monday through Friday for seminary. On Saturdays, I was doing things, going to church dances or helping with service projects. It was Sunday through Sunday. You lose a big part of that. Even if it caused you pain, you still lose that. And um, you start to realize, like I did, I started to look and go, wow, I kind of pushed that piece of my culture aside. I didn't want to really look at it or understand it. Um, and I've shaped my identity around this, and it's not true. So now what do I do? But I can tell anybody that's still in that holding pattern, deconstruction is also really freeing. It really allows you to look at your history, your culture, your beliefs from your own eyes, from your own view, instead of what you're taught, instead of what you read. And for me and anybody else that is of color, I really truly believe it means like reconnecting with your traditions, your language, um, stories that were there that you maybe didn't understand. Um, Again, the church sometimes overshadowed those things. And so deconstruction really isn't about destroying faith. It's really just separating what was given to us um, from what truly belonged to us so that we can decide for ourselves who we really are. And it takes time, um, but it gradually happens little bit by little bit.
I The next slide you mentioned in this part of the conversation, you mentioned loss of community, and the next slide is loss of community.
Mhm.
And in my mind, I'm just thinking like when I joined the church, I lost community. I lost certain kind of connection with my family. Part of it is because what you just said, which is that Mormonism requires so much of you, but then it also tells a story to the convert about about what their family is uh, lost in certain regards to not having the gospel, not having access to the ordinances, needing to be redeemed, needing to repent of sins like drinking coffee or tea and such minor things, right? And so I come into the church and I lose that connection with family. There was just it wasn't like a blatant thing, but it was this subtle distancing where the wards sort of filled in as my family, and my family was looked down upon. Mormonism taught me to do that, and so there's this distance. And then when I deconstruct the church, I lose it again because now I've lost this ward family. For the person who is in a larger culture, such as a tribe, it just seems to me to be so much more significant. And so, with that, maybe tell us a little bit about what loss of community was like for you.
Yeah, so I was born and raised from day one in the church. And when I stepped away several times, in my teens, in my 20s, and my 30s, I've stepped away from the church many times, and this last time was it for me. I was done. And there were people that I would talk with all the time, family, friends, longtime family friends. Um, and recently I went to an event and I had two people speak to me the whole time I was there. Um, I did not want to walk in that building at all because I knew the judgments. I knew in their eyes I wasn't good enough because I've lost my light, whatever that even means. Um, I remember at one point when I went to church with my mom right after my dad passed away, somebody told me that I was going to be a bad parent because I no longer had the church as a guide. Um, and so I think that, now there's still a couple of people that I definitely communicate with, but for the most part, if I needed help moving tomorrow, I have no one to call. If I was sick and needed a casserole or some lime jello, I don't have anybody to help out with that from a church perspective. And so knowing that there would be people there that I could count on um, is a little bit hard, but also we're required to serve. And so it's not like we always serve at the kindness of our heart. I'll help people move out of the kindness of our heart. Sometimes it's because it's required. And so, you know, there's definitely been some changes in my life of losing that, but there's so many more positives than losses.
You had mentioned earlier this sense of like, hey, you've deconstructed, you've stepped away, but there's still loss. It's not like
Mhm.
the believer often will look at the person who has lost belief and stepped away there's the old saying, for instance, that you can leave Mormonism, but you can't leave it alone. And really, it comes from this place of like these people you care about and you love, and you have a human connection with them, and they've served you and you've served them. And you spend years and years and years in this system being a part of it and being one of them. And even if your brain tells you it's no longer true and you step away, there's no way to avoid the loss of community. And that's such a general way to say it, but the loss of deep and meaningful friendships that you had over long periods of time with people who showed some sense of care and concern for you, and you returned that and showed care and concern for them. And now you're on the outside and they're taught to see you as less than, and you don't have the ease of talking to them because your thoughts and perceptions are going to be seen by them as disruptive. And so now there's this wedge in between. And I just have to imagine, again, when you come out of a larger culture like you do, I think that has to be even maybe more disruptive. Because now you got to figure out how to be not Mormon and fully Native American.
Yeah, it's definitely, I've heard people say this before that, when you leave the church, people don't know how to talk to you anymore because they talk about, oh, so and so's the bishop now, so and so's over this or that, and so that's the only conversations that they know how to have. I did this service project, or I helped this brother or sister, and so sometimes there's nothing to really talk about. For me, I think the biggest and hardest piece is being told to not speak out against the church. Ember, we don't want you talking against the church. But here, let me give you a pamphlet and a book written on mental health. Well, I just finished my master's and did a whole thesis on religion and mental health. But I was recently handed a book written by a member of the church, book bought at Deseret, about mental health. So it's okay for you to give me something, but I can say nothing. And I am not going to just sit and be quiet any longer. I'm not going to allow the community that I left tell me to be quiet when there are things that need to be said. And my story is real. And, I've touched on very few things of my story as we talk tonight. But at the same time, it's hard. It's hard for me because um, a lot of this goes really deep, and it goes really deep for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. Anything else on this one? Otherwise, we'll go to our last slide. And then I did put in the live chat the link for tonight. If anybody wanted to join the show and share a comment or ask Ember a question, I see DG, you're down there below. We'll get to you here in just a second. The last slide here is healing and reclaiming identity. So tell us, share your thoughts here.
So when people go through identity conflict, generational trauma, faith struggles, loss of community, healing obviously isn't going to happen all at once. I am still on that journey. I still attend counseling for all kinds of things because it takes time. It takes time to sort through what you are taught, what you experienced. What do you want to keep moving forward? And what do you want to throw away? So for many Native people who were raised in the church, healing starts with learning that our culture was never something that needed to be fixed. You didn't need to be fixed. The story and traditions and beliefs of our people existed long before the church ever did. And they have their own value, they have their own worth, and they're our stories. Part of reclaiming your identity while you're going through deconstruction is allowing yourself to be proud of where you come from. Feeling like, that you have to fit in someone's narrative, throw it out. You don't belong there. You belong in your own story. It means understanding that, being Native, for me, being Native doesn't make me less worthy. It doesn't make me less spiritual, and it doesn't make me less deserving of respect. Healing can also mean reconnecting with things that you've pushed aside. For me, it was spending more time with my native family, learning language, listening to elders, and truly allowing myself to just ask questions without the fear of shame of somebody telling me to doubt my doubts and not research. Um, and I think one thing with reclaiming is also it doesn't mean that you have to reject everything. I can tell you that the church taught me how to public speak, taught me how to lead music, it taught me how to lead discussions with people about, various topics within the church. There's a lot of things that I learned. And those are things that I'm really grateful for. I could talk for hours, as you can see. Um, and a lot of that is because I had to give talks starting at a very young age. And, you know, it's okay to keep the parts that brought you comfort, but let's get rid of the ones that cause harm and decide for yourself what you want to believe. Don't let anybody else tell you that you have to believe something a certain way to fit in a certain box. And I think finally, for many of us, um, healing really means realizing that we don't have to choose between being Native or being Mormon, and being our authentic self. We can carry our history, we can carry our culture, our experiences. Honestly, we can do it without shame. We can do it without somebody telling us that we're worthy or not worthy. And, um, just I just want to pause there and thank you both for allowing me to come on this platform because there's been so much that has been hurtful for people that have been called Lamanites. And, I think that the racism is real within the church. The foundation of it was written about Native people, and the story was not the right story. And so I really want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to come on your platform and talk about this.
You're very welcome. RFM, you had a question for Ember about where she's at now.
It sounds like she's partially answered it. It sounds like the church is a dot in your rear view mirror. When was it you made the final break and what caused it, Ember?
Well, I since I was a teen, I really started studying cults. I would go to the library and read books, and I would skip over Mormon stuff a lot. Wasn't supposed to read that, so I skipped it. But I will tell you that my husband, um, we've been together 11 years. He is not a member, and he just would ask me random questions sometimes. Well, what did you believe about that? Or why did you believe that? Or why are you doing this or that? And he allowed me to, and I say allowed, but I'm too independent for him allow me to do anything. But he really was like almost gave me the permission, the oomph that I needed to be able to start looking and researching. And so um around 2020, I just came across a random TikTok one day, and that pretty soon led me to a lot of podcasts and a lot of the church really does what? The church really believes this or that. I absolutely appreciate um, the ex Mormon space because it has really healed me to hear that I'm not alone. It's really healed me to know that, yes, our stories might be a little bit different, but they're similar. And so I am just, yes, the church is very much in my rearview mirror. And I am grateful that it is in my rearview mirror. It will always be a part of me. Um, I will probably never leave it alone, but that's what happens when you're told what to believe. And, there's certain pieces, like I said, that I hold on to because they are good.
Hmm. I think this is one of the last great powers of the LDS church. It's not the priesthood, it's not the keys, it's the power to make people who doubt think they're alone.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not going to leave it alone either. But I'll just ask the audience if this feels true, but when for the folks who criticize the church after leaving and who speak up trying to have conversations about things, doesn't it make sense that maybe those people cared that exact same amount on the other side too, that when we believed, there was an investment made, and we cared and we wanted to do this Mormon thing in a way that was honorable or intentional. And of course, when we leave, at least for me, my passion isn't a different level. I care the same about Mormonism on this end, trying to say things about it as I did on that end, learning all the things about it. There's a passion on both sides, and it isn't that someone was lazy and didn't care and then suddenly they become an enemy of the church. It's they cared just that much on that side of things too. Any other questions you've got, RFM? Otherwise, I'll bring DG on. And all right,
bring DG on and see what he has to say from West Texas.
Good evening, all. Ember, your story. Oh gosh, thank you for sharing, and of course, Bill Real and RFM for letting her share her story here. What a marvelous story, and it echoes and resonates, I think, with so many of us who are now outside the faith. Not quite to the extent of Indigenous peoples, and forgive me if I'm using the wrong words. I don't know the right vocabulary for this, but I'm curious. Were you ever ostracized by your tribe? I'm not sure that that's the proper way to ask the question, but how accepting were your people after you left the church? Did they ever ask you, well, you gave up your heritage, it's too late now, you can't come back? Or were they loving, accepting, open arms, bringing you back in? How tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Thanks for asking. Nobody cares. At the end of the day, with the tribe, nobody cares. I can tell you that I grew up attending, our local tribal powwow every year since I was tiny. But truly, if I was like, hey, DG, come with me, let's go to powwow, everybody would be open arms. They would be all about like, hey, let's talk to you about what this dance means or what this prayer is or what's happening right here. It's always open arms. And most of our events are open to the public, drug and alcohol free. You want to come, enjoy. We're just that way. We want to feed you. We want to make sure that you're taken care of while you're within the circle, is what we call it. I can tell you that there are plenty of times when I walked into a ward building and I did not feel that same. I felt dread. I was not taken care of the same. It was definitely, it wasn't the same feeling. And so with our tribe, nobody noticed. Nobody cares if you're religious or not. It does not matter. If you are there and you just want to hear the heartbeat of the drum, we're all in for whatever you want to do. If you want to come in and say a prayer and end in Jesus' name, by all means. We're not going to tell you to do it differently. And so, no, from that perspective, I have been very blessed and very grateful.
I really liked the point that you made that, the true history of your people predates the church by millennia, probably, if not, centuries, if not millennia. But they've probably figured out a lot of things. I would be very curious what, did I understand that you're Maori? Is that right?
So I'm Native American, but I grew up with the Polynesian culture as well.
Okay.
I am not Maori, but I grew up with that Polynesian culture. I danced Polynesian on stage. We did a lot of presentations growing up. My mom taught it in our home. And so I grew up with it. Yeah.
You must have been the hit at all of the youth dances in church. I'm curious what. I just forgot my question. I would be curious how your Native American traditions stack up against, say, the Word of Wisdom, some traditional healing arts, meditation. Meditation experiences in a Hogan versus, and that's a bad example, versus the temple. Yeah, I would be curious to contrast what those experiences might be. And the Mormon Church has this thing about names, labels definitely, but also about names. And I would be curious if, because a lot of the native people that I know here in West Texas, they have a second name, and I know that that brings back all kinds of horrible memories from Mormonism. But a new name, do you have a new name, and does it have a specific meaning behind it? Because I've always been fascinated by Indigenous peoples and what they call themselves and what they call each other. And I know it's been made fun of to a certain extent, with the Hollywood movies and things, but there is something to that. And I'm curious, do you have a name, and what does it mean? What does Ember mean to you?
So obviously the name Ember means fire. My mom purposely named me a element of earth. And in the Ojibwe language, fire is Ishkode, which is that's my native name is Ishkode, which means fire. So nothing fancy like walking thunder or running with bulls or
Dances with bears, or dances with
yeah,
wolves,
no.
Like paper, scissors, fire beats all of those.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's Joey Tribbiani and his little fire, rock, paper, scissors. But then I wanted to circle back, DG. You had made a comment about you don't know Native American, Indian, what words to use. And I can tell you that within the Native community, there are people that are perfectly fine being called Indian. There are people that are perfectly fine being called Indigenous. There are people fine being called with First Nations. So the best way to approach that is, what do you want to be called? I personally don't like hearing Indian because I am not from India. I am from here. I am a First Nations Indigenous woman. I'm a Native woman, a native of the American continent. But there are people that don't mind. So whatever you use, just ask the question. Questions within the Native community are welcomed. I was telling RFM earlier, one time we were at the drive-through and somebody asked me about my tattoo, and I briefly told them 10-second version and drove off. And one of my kiddos looked at me and said, "Mom, does that bother you when they ask?" And I said, "As long as they're respectful, I have no problem." I go, "It's when they're pointing and laughing that there's an issue."
So what's the 111? I didn't understand the reference to 111.
That is our marking, our tattoo.
There's three ones?
Usually 3 lines. They're just 3 lines. But people put in designs and flare it up for their own personality. And that's why I have my 7 generations before me. All the triangles here are the center 7 generations after me. And with the Maori triangle versus more of a triangle that like the native people here use, of which we would call like a salmon ladder.
Well, your story is phenomenal, and thank you so much. And I don't want to take any more time, but thank you so much, gentlemen, and love your story and would like to see more of this kind of content in the future.
Oh,
Thank you,
thanks,
D.
DG.
See you later, DG. Okay, Ember, I got a question I got to ask you. Now, how you answer it's up to you. Whether you answer it is obviously up to you, but I got to ask this question, okay? I don't want you to talk at all about the LDS temple or the LDS temple ceremony, okay? We're not talking about that at all.
Okay.
All I want to know is this. What was going on in the Native American ceremony when your mom walked away?
So I can briefly talk about it because it is something that we kind of hold sacred. But we were all in a circle, as you can imagine, something that happens in the temple. We were all in a circle having, and different people were praying. One person was playing from the north, one from the south, one from the east, one from the west. But we're all standing in a circle having a prayer, which is something very similar that happens in the temple. And so I
They
didn't
even
know
call
at
it a
the
prayer
moment.
circle in the temple. That's how similar it is.
Yeah, and that's something that we do often. We sit around the fire in a circle. We sit, because it's no beginning, no end.
Mhm.
And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you for being on today. DG, by the way, great questions. RFM, great questions. So glad for you to come on and share this. As you pointed out, what I think originated this conversation is that we are so often in the church tackling the race and priesthood issue and dealing with people of African descent, people of black skin. And for you to notify, say, like, hey, like, don't take anything away from that conversation. That conversation should happen just as much as it does, and more. But that this conversation also needs to happen where we talk about those of Mormon theology and how it affects Indigenous people, and how their story is both overlapping with other traumas that we all get in Mormonism, and then also in many ways really unique. And I think those conversations do need to happen. So thank you so much for being on today.
Yeah. Thank you again so much. This is from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm gonna let you go. I want to check in with RFM. I know he's got a show coming out this week. I want to give him a chance to talk about that. But thank you so much for being on today's episode. So
Yeah. Thank you guys.
Bye, Ember. Thank you.
Bye-bye. All right. Before we sort of close this out, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about a show you've got coming up.
It's got its own soundtrack.
Deliverance.
I thought about putting that guy in the background, but no, sometimes less is more. Mormon Bishop Rebel. I'm sorry, what, Bill?
Feel like a pig. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes. Sui, Mormon Bishop rebels. We're gonna have Nathan Hinckley on the show, and we're gonna talk about what he talked about at Thrive. He gave such an incredible performance at Thrive. I thought he was like, I just really appreciated his presentation. I wanted him to replicate that on the show, and we're going to talk about some additional things. And maybe we got our fingers crossed. Maybe his wife Amy will show up too. It's not for sure, but maybe.
All right. Well, Mormon Bishop Rebels RFM. This will be Saturday.
You see, and that's the thing about it. It's kind of a play on words. Is it Mormon Bishop Rebels or is it Mormon Bishop Rebels?
Oh. Okay.
See, if your picture up there, Mormon Bishop Rebels would work equally as well.
There you go.
I was only a second counselor.
Mormon Bishop Rebels, Radio Free Mormon. This will be Saturday. Is this going to come out like 7 p.m. you said?
Yes.
Okay.
7 or 6, whatever it is. I'm sorry. I fluctuate a little bit depending upon the ultimate length of the episode. Shorter, I put on a little bit later so people don't have to stay up so late. But if it's longer, I put it on earlier. Always thinking of you. That's how Radio Free Mormon rolls.
Love it. So check that out, folks. And then I'll just note too, episode comes out next Thursday is the Kinderhook plates. And so this is the next one in the series that I'm working on. So those come out on Thursday mornings. All right, RFM, very much appreciate you being here tonight. Glad that Ember could come on and share the things that she's talking about. Folks, please like and subscribe, and donating is how we survive. So if you go to mormonismlive.org, please click that donate button. Send a few bucks this way. This is how we're able to put the time and energy in producing content that comes out almost every day of the week to keep you both informed and up to date and entertained, frankly. Much kudos to RFM for being here and doing the work that you do as well. And looking forward to your episode on Saturday. Folks, good night. This was Mormonism Live. We will see you next Wednesday, 6 p.m. Until then, have a great night.
Good night.